Living at home at 23 wasn't exactly the life I had imagined for myself, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't all that bad either. I wasn't some kind of freeloading adult who still expected mom to take care of everything. In fact, I had my own responsibilities and did my part around the house. I paid rent, covered the electricity bill, and even picked up the tab for my mom's phone plan. It wasn't like I was just lying around eating snacks and playing video games all day. Honestly, the setup worked pretty well for me. I had my own space, home-cooked meals, and the ability to focus on my freelance work without worrying too much about mounting bills or being too broke to order food. I had even turned my room into a mini studio for my content creation gigs, hoping that one day, if things worked out, I'd be able to turn it into something more serious. It was a comfortable life, the kind that allowed me to make the most out of my passion projects while still being able to save a little here and there. Everything was going smoothly until Kelly moved in. Kelly was my mom's best friend. I had grown up hearing about her, seeing her at family gatherings, and even spending some time with her kids when we were younger. She wasn't a regular visitor, but we all knew each other well enough. I had no issues with Kelly personally, but when she and her 2 kids moved into our house, that was when things started to get complicated. At first, I wasn't thrilled about the idea. My mom's house wasn't huge to begin with, and I had gotten used to my own little bubble, but I understood the situation. Kelly had been going through a brutal divorce. Her husband, according to my mom, was a complete jerk who made things far harder for her than they needed to be. After a few rounds of back and forth, Kelly had no other option but to leave. She didn't have the resources to get her own place right away, and since she had nowhere else to go, she and her kids moved in with us. I wasn't happy about it, but I tried to remind myself that this was supposed to be temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month at most, while Kelly sorted things out. So I gritted my teeth and told myself it would be fine. At first, things weren't too bad. Kelly and her kids settled into the guest room, and life carried on as usual. It was a little crowded, sure, but not unbearable. The kids were loud, as kids tend to be, but I figured I could deal with it. I just closed my door, put on my headphones, and went about my day as usual. It wasn't like we were all constantly on top of each other. Kelly mostly kept to herself, and I kept my routine. But then, things started to shift. Little by little, the space we had was slowly being taken over. First, it was Kelly's stuff. Clothes, bags, and random items started showing up in the living room. Then, her kids, who were both under the age of 10, began to take over the common areas. The TV that I had once claimed as my own for nights when I wanted to unwind became a battleground for who got to watch what. The kitchen, once a peaceful place where I could grab a snack or cook a meal, was always filled with the sounds of Kelly's kids fighting over cereal or arguing over whose turn it was to use the bathroom. But the real tipping point came when my room, the one space I could retreat to, was no longer mine. One evening, after a long day of work, I went to my room to find it different. Kelly had moved some of her things into my space, and I found her oldest child, her 8-year-old daughter, sitting on my bed playing with my gaming console. I was taken aback. I didn't mind the kids being around, but I didn't expect them to take over my personal space like that. I stood there staring at the scene in disbelief. My room had always been my sanctuary. It was where I had my desk, my equipment for content creation, and where I could finally relax. Now, it was just another shared space. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, Kelly asked if I could borrow your room for a little bit," her daughter said, barely looking up from the screen. "She said it's a lot quieter in here and I wanted to play." I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I was trying to hold it together, but I couldn't help but feel resentful. My mom never consulted me about this change. I wasn't a guest in my own home. I was paying bills, pulling my weight, and this was supposed to be my space. It wasn't fair. I turned around and walked out of the room. I didn't know what to do. I needed space, but it felt like it was being taken away from me bit by bit. As the days passed, my frustration continued to build. It wasn't that I didn't understand Kelly's situation. She was going through a tough time and needed a place to stay. But this was starting to feel like more than just a temporary arrangement. It felt like I was being pushed out of my own home. The final straw came a few days later when my mom asked me if I could help Kelly with a few things. She was juggling so much with her kids and her divorce, and she could use a hand. It wasn't just the request itself that bothered me, but the way it was framed. It was as if my needs and space didn't matter anymore. That was when I decided I needed a change. I couldn't keep living like this, feeling like an outsider in my own home. The last thing I wanted was to create tension or make things worse for Kelly and her kids. But I realized that I couldn't just sit back and let it continue. So I packed my things, grabbed my laptop, and headed out. I didn't have a permanent place to go, but I knew I needed to get out of that environment before I completely lost my mind. I found a quiet spot in a nearby cafe to think things through. Mom called a few times, but I didn't answer. I just needed some space. When I finally did pick up, she was upset. "Where are you? Why haven't you been home? Kelly and the kids are asking for you." I couldn't hold back the frustration in my voice. "Mom, I need you to understand something. I've been paying bills at that house. That's my room. I didn't sign up for this. I don't mind helping out, but I can't live like this." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand, honey," she said quietly. "But you can't just leave like this. You're part of this family too. Kelly needs us." I felt my heart tighten, but I stood firm. "I'm sorry, but I need some time away from all of this. I can't just keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." And that was the beginning of what would turn into an incredibly tense situation, one that would ultimately have me questioning what family really meant. Things started getting tense after Kelly and her kids moved in. At first, it wasn't a huge deal. They stayed in the guest room, and I could deal with the occasional noise. But as the days passed, I began to feel the impact more and more. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was the space, the lack of privacy, and honestly, the disrespect that started to build up. The tipping point came one night when I got home to find my mom talking with Kelly in the living room, discussing who needed to pay for what. I had just finished a long day of freelancing and was already irritated. The house was crowded, my room was off limits, and now it seemed like no one was considering how this situation was affecting me. Mom and I started talking about the bills. She had her usual worried look on her face, trying to balance everything on her shoulders. I had been paying for most of the utilities, and at that point, I was beginning to wonder why I was even still contributing. Kelly and her kids were eating into our resources, and it was clear my mom wasn't going to change anything anytime soon. "Maybe I shouldn't be paying anything at all," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My mom's eyes narrowed instantly, her tone sharp. "Don't you dare pull that on me! You know I need your help with the bills," I snapped, unable to hold it in any longer. "Then treat me like I matter. You can't just take my money every month and then turn around and tell me I have no say in what happens in my own house. That's not how this works." She looked at me like I was crazy, the disbelief clear on her face. "What do you want me to do? Throw Kelly and her kids out on the street? They have nowhere else to go." I shook my head, frustrated. "No, but there are other options. They could stay in the guest room, or they could move into one of my siblings' rooms. Hell, you could even rotate rooms so everyone takes turns sharing the space. But taking my room and locking me out of it? That's not okay." She crossed her arms defensively, already thinking of reasons to justify the situation. "Your brother and sister are too young to share their rooms, and the guest room is too small for 3 people. Your room was the best option." "No," I shot back, my frustration rising. "It was the easiest option. You didn't want to deal with the hassle, so you dumped it all on me. I'm not okay with that." By now, I could feel my anger boiling over. My voice grew sharper, but I couldn't hold back anymore. "I'll make this simple," I said, staring her straight in the eyes. "Either Kelly and the kids move out of my room, or I move out of this house. Those are your options." She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Don't be ridiculous. Where would you even go?" "I've already started looking for rooms to rent," I told her, my tone calm but firm. "If you're not going to respect me or the fact that I'm paying to live here, then I'll find somewhere else to live." She scoffed, clearly dismissing the idea. "You're bluffing. You can't afford to move out." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Try me." The days that followed were tense. We didn't bring up the ultimatum again, but I could feel the weight of it hanging between us like a storm cloud, ready to burst. My mom didn't take me seriously, which only made me more determined. I spent every spare moment scrolling through rental listings, trying to find somewhere, anywhere, outside of this house. The idea of moving out was terrifying, but the thought of staying here and continuing to be treated like I didn't matter was even worse. I wasn't sure if my mom thought I was bluffing, but the longer things went on, the less I cared. She had underestimated me, and now I had to prove her wrong. The tension at home made everything feel more difficult. Work, my content creation, even just getting through the day. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. Something had to change. The days following that conversation were tense, to say the least. I could feel the weight of the ultimatum hanging over my head. My mom didn't take me seriously, and it only made me more determined to follow through with what I had said. I had already started looking for rooms to rent, and after a few days of searching, I found a place. It wasn't much, just a small room in an older building, but it was quiet, private, and, most importantly, mine. When I told my friends what I was planning to do, they were quick to help. They came over that morning, and we started packing up my things. One of them even filmed it, just in case things went south with my mom or Kelly. I didn't trust that they wouldn't try to make me feel guilty for leaving. It wasn't that I was leaving out of spite. It was because I couldn't stay in a place where I wasn't respected. By the time we had everything packed and ready, my mom came upstairs to see what was going on. When she saw the empty room, she lost it. "Are you really doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger. "You're leaving us just because you didn't get your way?" I looked her straight in the eye, my voice steady, even though everything inside me was boiling over. "I'm leaving because you didn't respect me. I paid rent for this room and you gave it away without even asking. You made it clear that I'm not a priority here, so I'm making myself a priority." She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, silencing her. "Don't. I've made my decision." With that, I carried the last of my boxes out to the van. Kelly was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her face twisted in a scowl. She looked me up and down before sneering. "Good luck out there. You're going to realize how selfish you've been when things get hard." I didn't even bother responding. I just climbed into the van and let my friends drive me away. The sound of the engine humming was a strange kind of freedom, like the weight on my shoulders had been lifted, even though I knew it was far from over. That night, after I moved into my new place and started unpacking, my phone exploded with messages from my mom. I ignored most of them, but a few stuck out. She was furious, accusing me of being selfish and inconsiderate. One text read, "You've always been so selfish. I can't believe you'd do this to me after everything I've done for you." I stared at the screen for a few seconds, feeling the anger bubble up again. I typed a response, something sharp, something that would explain everything, but I deleted it before I could send it. I didn't owe her an explanation. She had made her choices, and now I was making mine. The first thing I felt after settling in was relief. No more fighting, no more disrespect, and most importantly, no more feeling like I didn't matter. Sure, my new room was smaller, and the building wasn't exactly top-notch, but it was quiet. It was mine. No one could take it from me, and no one could decide how I used it. That feeling of ownership, of finally being in control of my own space, was worth every ounce of discomfort. As I unpacked, I realized just how much I had been holding on to. I had spent so long trying to make things work at home, bending over backwards to keep the peace. But in the end, I had to make a choice. And now, for the first time in a long while, I could breathe. Story 2. The title of this story is, "My Golden Sister's Success Caused My Family to Abandon Me. She is now pleading with me for assistance." Hello everyone. Finding these tales for you took a lot of time. Please click the subscribe button if you like the article. It keeps this adventure going strong and means the world. Together, let's develop. Let's begin the video now. OP says, "Hello Reddit" in the beginning. I need to get this off my chest, but I'm not even sure where to begin. I felt invisible in my own family for a long time, and I've lately come to understand how profound that invisibility is. Sarah, my 36-year-old sister, has always been the family's star. She is the ideal child, incapable of doing anything wrong. A 32-year-old woman, was simply present. However, I'm tired of being invisible. I will no longer tolerate their disregard for me. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs, the partiality was immediately apparent. Even our neighbors, I believe, saw Sarah as the one. She was intelligent and gregarious, everything parents boast about. My mom would really phone our extended family to inform them if I received the same grade as Sarah, if she aced an exam. That quote s good. My dear, what's for supper? I wasn't some lazy, mind you. I kept out of trouble, worked hard, and received high marks. But I was almost unnoticeable in comparison to Sarah. I was the reserved, scholarly child who would rather code in my room than play the lead in a school production. And to be honest, at first I didn't mind. Being the focus of attention was something Sarah enjoyed. I also didn't want the attention. However, the distance between us widened as we grew older. Sarah's achievements became significant events in the family. When she graduated from a prestigious business school, when she was prom queen, and when she was accepted into her ideal institution, they greeted each one as though she had won an Olympic medal. I recall her acceptance to her business school. My folks were ecstatic. They covered more than just her tuition. They went all out. She received money for spring break vacations, a new outfit to fit in, and a stylish apartment in a posh area of town. At the time, I was in high school and attempting to determine how I would ever pay for college. The solution? Stress, part-time work, and student loans. Let's fast forward several years. I received honors in computer science when I graduated from college. It wasn't simple. For 4 years, I essentially lived off of stress and coffee while working 2 part-time jobs and taking out loans. I felt like I had ascended Mount Everest as I crossed the stage with my certificate in hand. I had the hope that my folks would be pleased. My mother responded, "That's nice, honey." Instead, "Have you looked at the pictures taken at Sarah's graduation? She looks amazing in that outfit, doesn't she?" That's my life, yes. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter for a time. I was earning enough money to cover my expenses from a respectable position as a project manager at a digital firm. However, I want more. I hope to advance and eventually launch my own business. I made the decision to apply to an MBA school at that point. This was no ordinary program. It took place at one of the nation's top colleges. I was aware that it would revolutionize my professional path. However, there was a significant obstacle. Tuition was in the 6 digits. 6. I did something I never would have thought to do since I knew I couldn't afford it on my own. I sought assistance from my parents. Allow me to introduce the situation. The meal was a family gathering, and the topic of conversation was Sarah as usual. She just achieved great success in the family eatery. Later, more on that. And my folks were so proud that they were virtually beaming. I didn't mention it until dessert. I reluctantly requested if they could assist with tuition or even simply co-sign a loan after telling them about the MBA program and how it would open possibilities for me. I begged them to sell a kidney, you know. As if I had just insulted her, my mother clutched her chest. My father's face flushed. That's beyond our means. They claimed that we had already covered Sarah's tuition. We must now concentrate on our retirement and the family restaurant. All right, I understand. The cost of an MBA is high. They didn't simply refuse to pay, though. They wouldn't even co-sign by themselves. I wasn't requesting a handout exactly. I was requesting assistance. Just enough to keep me from spending the rest of my life drowning in debt. It was the most painful part. Mom's logic, she said, looking directly into my eyes. Sarah's education was an investment in the family business. Your MBA would only benefit you. Wouldn't it only benefit me? Like I wasn't part of this family. Like my success didn't matter because it wasn't tied to their plans. It was like being slapped across the face. I was angry. But more than that, I was hurt. Sarah's education was a family investment, but mine was a waste of money. I felt like I was back in high school, invisible and unimportant. But I wasn't a teenager anymore. I wasn't going to let them stop me. That's when I turned to Aunt Margaret. Margaret is my dad's older sister. And let me tell you, she's a badass. She's a neurosurgeon. Yeah, but a literal brain surgeon. And she's always been the cool aunt who takes no crap from anyone. My parents have always had this weird tension with her. They pretend to be polite at family gatherings, but I've overheard them bad-mouthing her success. My dad especially hates feeling overshadowed by her. He once called her arrogant because she didn't let him win an argument. Seriously, I wasn't sure if she'd help, but I was desperate. I called her one evening, explained the situation, and asked if she could loan me some money for tuition. Her response: "Why didn't you come to me earlier?" "Of course I'll help. I believe in you," I cried. Not the cute movie kind of crying, the ugly, snotty kind. For the first time in my life, someone in my family believed in me. She didn't see me as the awkward little sister or the family afterthought. She saw potential. Margaret covered my tuition without hesitation, but we both knew it had to stay a secret. If my dad found out, he'd lose his mind. He'd see it as me going behind his back, and Sarah would probably make it her mission to ruin things. So we kept it quiet, and for a while everything was fine. But secrets don't stay secrets for long. And when Sarah found out, everything I'd worked for came crashing down. One point should be updated. Hey, read it back again. So after Aunt Margaret helped me with my MBA tuition, I thought the worst was behind me. My objective was to keep my head down, finish school, and show to myself, and maybe a bit to my family, that I was worth something. For a time, everything were tranquil, to calm in hindsight. I should have known it wouldn't last. I still don't know exactly how Sarah found out about the deal with Aunt Margaret. Maybe she overheard something. Maybe she snooped through my emails. Not a stretch. She was always the sort to read over your shoulder when you were on your phone. Either way, she found out. And in classic Sarah manner, she didn't simply confront me or talk to me like a regular person. No. She went full nuclear the night everything went down. I was heading home after a hard day at work. I'd been working my ass trying to keep up with my job while prepared for my MBA orientation. I was feeling terrific, thrilled even for once. It seemed like my life was heading in the correct path. However, I saw there was a problem as soon as I entered the room. There was silence in the house. It was a heavy, strained type of silence, not the calm kind. Something was wrong with the air, similar to the quiet before a storm. My heart dropped, but I made an effort to ignore it. They could simply be exhausted, I told myself. Yes, no. My blood froze when I entered the living room. Everything I had, including books, clothes, and bedding, was put into boxes. Like a huge neon sign that says, "You don't belong here anymore." They just sit there. I tried to take in what I was seeing as I gazed at the boxes. Was this a joke of any sort? Did I somehow forget that we were moving? Then I saw Sarah. She had a smug, contented expression on her face and was standing off to the side with her arms crossed. My folks were seated on the sofa. They had a mixture of despair and rage on their faces. "What's happening?" My voice was tremulous as I asked. My father wasted no time. He picked up a pile of papers off the sofa table and hurled them in my direction. "Describe this." He made a demand. I took up the papers and began looking through them, confused. I was initially confused by what I was seeing. Then it dawned on me. They were electronic mails. I sent Aunt Margaret a phony email. They gave the impression that I had betrayed the family. These emails claimed that I had given Aunt Margaret the trade secrets of the family restaurant in return for her covering my tuition. Recipes, supplier information, financial documentation. Everything was there. It seemed as though someone had hit me in the gut. The emails were all made up. They were accusing me of distributing things that I had never even seen. To be honest, I was unable to access the most of it. However, do you know who did? Sarah. She clearly manipulated these emails. Come on, I wasn't working at the restaurant, she was. My parents didn't care that she had access to all the private data. They didn't question it at all. They only needed the proof that Sarah gave them. It's not real. These emails were a stutter. They're not real. This is not what I did. My dad looked like he was going to blow up, and my mom was weeping. He continued, his voice trembling with rage. "We trusted you. How could you have betrayed us in this manner?" They refused to listen to my explanations. I pleaded with them to examine the emails more closely so they could notice the clear indications that they were fake. They didn't care, though. Sarah was arrogant but silent as she stood there. She continued to cross her arms. She didn't need to speak. It was all in her face. She had prevailed. "Gather your belongings and head off." My father's voice was icy and decisive. "No traitor will be allowed in this house." I prayed and hoped that my mother would defend me, but all she did was sit there with tears in her eyes and shake her head. She was unable to look at me. Sarah, on the other hand, didn't try to conceal her happiness. She wanted more than just me gone. She wanted my erasure. That was it. I was being thrown out by my own family, who were meant to love and support me. Based on a number of falsehoods. I had no idea what to do. I wanted to fight, to scream, to show them the truth. However, a part of me knew it was useless. They had already decided. They saw me as guilty, and that wouldn't change no matter what I said. So I packed the few boxes of stuff I still had in my car. I was filling the final box. I caught a glimpse of the neighbors looking out of their windows. Most likely, they wanted to know what kind of drama was happening. I felt totally alone, deceived and humiliated. I did the only thing that came to mind after getting into my car. I gave Aunt Margaret a call. I was crying so much that I was having trouble speaking. I told her everything. How she had falsified the emails and how Sarah had discovered it. How I was expelled by my parents before I had a chance to defend myself. Margaret said, "Come to my place," in a tone that was firm but calm at the moment. "Together, we will solve this." That evening, I drove to her apartment. My vision is blurry the entire time due to tears. I felt safe for the first time that night when she gave me a hug so tight when I arrived that I thought I might burst. I mean, perhaps, just possibly, I wasn't totally alone. The days that followed were a blur. Margaret promised to still pay my tuition and offered me a place to stay. She was indifferent to the opinions of Sarah and my parents. "You are capable," she informed me. "Furthermore, I will not allow their petty behavior to impede your future." I made an effort to concentrate on getting ready for my MBA program, but the memory of that evening kept coming back to me. I kept playing it over and over in my mind. My parents' irate expressions. Sarah grinned smugly. My mom's tears. I was unable to wake up from what seemed like a dreadful dream. Part of me wanted to fight back. I knew I could show the emails were phony if I went deep enough. But another part of me was so exhausted, tired of trying to gain my family's approval, tired of being treated like I didn't matter. Maybe it was time to let go. Margaret was my rock. During those weeks, Mom kept telling me that this was an opportunity to start new, to construct a life on my terms. Sometimes, she added, the greatest thing you can do is walk away. And she was correct. It was time to quit pursuing their approval. I needed to take care of myself. Version 2.0. Hello Reddit, I've returned. It seems both soothing and weird to write this. I lived with Aunt Margaret after being evicted from my parents' home and worked to rebuild my life. It was challenging, very difficult. In all honesty, I was a little disoriented, furious, and devastated. However, at the time, I was unaware that being kicked out was the finest thing that had ever happened to me. Allow me to transport you back to those initial weeks. I was a wreck of emotions. I had trouble falling asleep. I was unable to eat. Additionally, I always saw Sarah's arrogant face when I closed my eyes. I kept thinking about how my mom couldn't even look at me when my dad branded me a traitor. The rejection was quite painful. This, though, was the first time I'd ever been their favorite. This was really different. Sarah's falsehoods led them to expel me from the house before I had a chance to defend myself. During those difficult times, Aunt Margaret was my pillar of support. I was able to comprehend all that had happened, grieve and vent in a safe place thanks to her. She never advised me to move on or pass judgment on me. She simply listened. She kept reminding me that I wasn't the issue. Favoritism has blinded them for so long that they are unable to see what they are losing, she remarked. However, you can succeed without their permission. Her words were like a lifeline to me. She was correct, in my life for the first time. It was not necessary for me to dwell in Sarah's shadow. I didn't have to compare myself to their unattainable standards. I had freedom. However, freedom was not without its difficulties. I still had to cope with the emotional consequences and find out how to go through my MBA school. A few weeks after I moved in with Aunt Margaret, classes began, and I threw myself into them as if they were my only chance. To be honest, it sort of did. It was my responsibility to show to myself that I was capable. I've always felt like a failure because of my family. The Master of Business Administration program was rigorous. There was a lot of labor. Expectations were quite high, and the competition was intense. You know what, though? I was surrounded by people who appreciated my abilities and thoughts for the first time. My teachers thought I had promise. I began to believe in myself in a manner I had never done before, and I gained the respect of my peers. But it wasn't simple. On certain days, the burden of everything seemed insurmountable. I would be attempting to concentrate on a business strategy lesson in class, then all of a sudden my thoughts would return to that evening. The phony emails, the boxes, and my dad's icy voice asking me to go. Until the tears stopped, I would have to excuse myself and hide in the restroom. But Aunt Margaret was always on my mind when I wanted to give up Dot. She had put a lot of money into me, emotionally as well as financially. I couldn't disappoint her. Above everything else, I couldn't fail myself. I thus put in more effort than I had ever done in my life. I volunteered for every group project, studied late into the night, and made a ton of connections. I discovered how to speak up during class debates and follow my gut. Eventually, I began to regain my self-confidence. By the time I had my degree, I wasn't only getting by, I was doing well. It felt like a victory to graduate first in my class, not only for the program, but also for all of the hardships my family had endured. I felt less like the awkward, neglected sibling for once. I was myself, able, powerful, deserving. I got a job at a prominent consulting business after I graduated. It fulfilled every desire I had ever had, demanding, quick-paced, and brimming with development prospects. I put the same amount of effort into my work that I did into my MBA program. What did you know paid off? My commitment was noted by my supervisors. My coworkers respected me, and my clients valued my thoughts. I felt as though I was right where I should be for the first time in my life. I also became closer to Aunt Margaret during this period. She was more than simply my aunt. She was a member of my family. We would discuss anything from my most recent business initiatives to her medical situations during our weekly dinner dates. I learned a lot from her about advocating for myself, appreciating my value, and not allowing others to control my destiny. Meanwhile, Sarah and my folks quiet. Nothing. No calls, no texts. It ached at first. I kept expecting them to get in touch, say they were sorry, and acknowledge their error. But as time passed, I came to see how fortunate I was to have them gone, without being burdened by their unrelenting criticism and partiality. At last, I could concentrate on myself. That was how 3 years passed. I created connections that felt real, a work I enjoyed, a life I was proud of, and a sense of self-worth I had never experienced before. When Sarah unexpectedly came up at my home, I believed my family turmoil was over. I nearly failed to identify her. The sleek, self-assured Sarah was no more. With whom I had grown up, she had changed appearance, weary. She had shadows across her eyes. Her hair was tied back in an untidy bun, and her clothing were crumpled. I just gazed at her for a while. I quote am at a loss for words. "Hello," she said quietly. "Can we have a conversation?" I was unwilling to allow her in. I wanted to smash the door in her face with all my might, but somehow she overcame me. I moved to make room for her. She sat uncomfortably squirming on my couch. She seemed desperate, but I could sense she didn't want to be there. She blurted it out at last. "I need your assistance. The family eatery, apparently. Our family's golden kid." Failure was what my parents had given up everything for. They were drowning in debt, and the expansion had been a fiasco. My parents were in a panic because bankruptcy was imminent. Despite her best efforts, Sarah was unable to resolve the situation on her own. "Dad is discussing declaring bankruptcy." Her voice broke as she said, "Mom is a complete mess. I'm at a loss on what to do. After what they had done to me, I sat there in shock. They required my assistance now." The irony was nearly comical. I wanted to tell her to go out and deal with her mess the same way I had. However, there was a tiny, foolish part of me that felt something. Not sympathy. That's right, perhaps. Duty, curiosity, perhaps. Perhaps only the specter of our former sisterly closeness. "What are you looking for from me?" I inquired. She paused. "Both your employment and your MBA are going really well for you. I hoped you could. I'm not sure. Assist." She didn't continue her statement, but I understood what she was actually asking. Perhaps give us some guidance. She desired money. They all did. I was enraged, but I assured her I would give it some thought. They had been silent for 3 years, but now they were only interested in me because they needed something, as well as Sarah's pathetic apologies. "I made a mistake. I apologize. It was insufficient, not even close. Go through it. I'm at a loss on what to do. Do I assist them? Should I let them sink or not? The third update. Reddit, hello. I'm back once more. If you've been paying attention, you're aware of how chaotic this situation has been. 3 years later, Sarah knocked on my door and asked for assistance. She didn't resemble the self-assured, polished individual I recalled. Her comments poured out like she was holding to a lifeline, demonstrating her desperation. And to be honest, I was conflicted. That night I was angry, perplexed, and a bit depressed when Sarah departed. There was a part of me that wanted to shut her and everything down. She stood for the years of partiality, treachery, and deceit. But below all the rage, there was a small voice inside of me that couldn't help but feel anything. I'm not sure if it was duty, sympathy, or simply the enduring brother tie. Whatever it was, it prevented me from ignoring her entirely. But my parents all turned up right when I thought I had time to come to terms with it. Yes, you read correctly. My parents arrived at my place of employment. Allow me to introduce the situation. The afternoon at work was typical, presenting a strategy suggestion to a customer in the middle of a meeting. When I was buzzed by my assistant. She continued, "There are 2 people in the lobby who are requesting you. They're your parents, they say." I went cold. It had been more than 3 years since I last heard from my parents. Not a single email, text, or phone call. They had now arrived at my workplace. I excused myself and made my way to the foyer, my heart pounding. They were there. My father, who used to appear larger than life, now appeared smaller and older. In some way, his face was furrowed with fatigue, and his shoulders were slumped. My mother, who always took care in her well-groomed appearance, wore her gray hair in an untidy bun. They appeared to be defeated. "Can we have a conversation?" my father inquired. He spoke in a low, gruff voice. I brought them to a coffee shop down the street since I didn't want to have this topic at work. We sat in uncomfortable quiet, the burden of our 3-year separation looming over us. I remained silent. I waited for them to speak. The first person to speak out was my mother. She remarked in a shaky voice, "We were wrong. You shouldn't have been expelled by us. We ought to have paid attention to you. We apologize." For years I dreamt of this moment. My parents acknowledged their mistakes, expressing regret for their actions, but I felt nothing now that it was occurring. No comfort, no contentment. Just a void that is hollow. Perhaps it was too late, too little. Then my father said something. "You should return home, please. We can succeed as a family even if we are going through a difficult moment." The reality began to surface at that point. It wasn't simply a failed eatery, it was a complete catastrophe. With the growth, my parents had gone beyond and taken on enormous debt that they were unable to pay back. In an effort to conserve money, they had also been taking shortcuts, which resulted in tax problems, health code infractions, and even some dubious supplier agreements. They now faced possible legal issues and were in danger of going bankrupt. They also wanted me to come to their rescue. "We need your assistance. According to my dad, you could help us turn things around because of your contacts and business expertise." I sat in disbelief. It was all so utterly ridiculous. On the basis of phony emails, they kicked me out of their home. It took them 3 years to get in touch with me, and now they looked to me to save them when they were in trouble. I struggled to maintain a calm voice as I continued. "Let me get this straight. I was ejected by you, blindly accepted Sarah's falsehoods. 3 years passed before they spoke to me again. Do you now want me to jeopardize everything I've accomplished in order to protect you from your own errors?" My mother grabbed my hand from the other side of the table. She was crying uncontrollably. She said, "We know we don't deserve your help. We are family, though. Families stay together." The word family struck me like a ton of bricks. I had spent years attempting to gain their acceptance and fit in with this family that never thought I was good enough. They were now use it as a negotiating tool. I inhaled deeply. "I apologize." I said, "I was surprised at how composed I sounded, but I am unable to assist you. You're asking me to jeopardize everything I've worked so hard to achieve, including my reputation and profession. I refuse to do it." Their expressions were a mixture of bewilderment and rage. The voice of my father increased. "Following everything that we have done for you, how do you pay us back?" I couldn't contain my laughter, chilly and bitter. "For me, what have you done? Denied me financial aid for my schooling while covering Sarah's. Used fictitious proof to expel me from the residence. For 3 years they ignored me. You haven't helped me in any way. Even though my mother was crying now, I didn't feel bad about it. No more. I got up and picked up my luggage. I looked them each in the eye and said, I'm sorry you're in this situation. However, this is the outcome of your own decisions. You cannot be saved by me. My father yelled after me as I left. This is something you'll regret. You're leaving your family behind? I came to a halt and turned around. You were the first to desert me, my voice said. Steady, you'll have to deal with that now. I gave things a lot of thought that evening. It was a sense of closure to leave my parents. However, it was insufficient. Their financial failure wasn't the only one. The law was being broken by them. More individuals may be harmed if they continued. Whether it was patrons dining at a dangerous restaurant or workers losing their jobs. Thus, I had to make the most difficult choice of my life. I filed a report on them. I made touch with the relevant authorities, the IRS, and the health department. I informed them of what I know while emphasizing that I had no involvement in their activities. The decision was not simple. I had the feeling that I was betraying them. I had a gut feeling that it was the proper thing to do. The consequences were immediate. My parents and Sarah faced severe legal repercussions, and the business was closed while the inquiry was ongoing. Sarah accused me of destroying the family and phoned me sobbing and yelling. In their voicemails, my parents alternated between pleading for assistance and threatening to take legal action. I didn't give up, though. Throughout it all, Aunt Margaret was my pillar of support. She reminded me that although it's not always simple, doing the right thing is essential. She answered, "You didn't destroy the family. That's what they did to themselves. The inquiry is still under progress." As my parents' world falls apart, Sarah is rushing to put everything back together. But I'm at last free, devoid of their poison, partiality, and manipulation. I quote, "We created a life I enjoy, a work I adore, sincere friendships, and a self-worth independent of their approbation. Thank you, Reddit, for bearing with me, encouraging me, and supporting me along my trip. I cannot express how much your counsel and thoughtfulness have meant to me. Cheers to new beginnings, families, and enjoying life as we see fit. Let quote S toast. Story 3. My golden brother mistreated me throughout my early years, and my parents supported him. They are now pleading with me for assistance. Hello, everyone. I've been spending a lot of time locating these tales for you, and the channel has been a little sluggish lately. Please click the subscribe button if you like the article. It keeps this adventure going strong and means the world. Together, let's develop. Let's begin the video now. OP begins by stating that Christmas 2015 was a catastrophe waiting to happen, but I was only 15 at the time and was unaware of it. The unnoticed middle kid of a 3-sibling family. My little sister was too small to be involved in anything, and my elder brother Dan, the golden child, was 19. Dan was constantly the center of attention. In the view of my parents, Dan the child could do no wrong. He was the affable sportsman, the one who laughed loudly and exuded confidence. When we were younger, I used to admire him, but eventually that adoration turned into animosity. Dan had a vicious temper that turned into a weapon when he drank, which he had been doing since he was almost old enough to drive. The Christmas dinner table continued to look flawless. Mom had gone beyond with the decor, arranging candles with cinnamon and pine scents and gleaming tableware. Dad pretended to be interested in football, while really taking sips of alcohol from his cup while hovering close to the television. Before we even sat down, Dan had already had 3 beers. As I carried a tray of roasted vegetables to the table, Dan grinned at me and said, "Nice apron. Mom, did you take over the kitchen once more, her little sous chef? What are you?" My cheeks were burning, but I ignored him. I enjoyed assisting Mom in the kitchen, but Dan never missed an opportunity to make fun of something I liked. Dan was intoxicated and brimming with negative energy by the time dinner began. He was sarcastic about everything: the food, Mom's centerpiece arrangement, and Dad's non-existent culinary abilities. But as usual, I was his favorite target. "In math, are you still receiving CS? Loser." He spoke loudly enough to be heard by all. "Do not be concerned. Some people aren't suited for college. Perhaps you could work as a chef or something. You quote, re-skilled at transporting trays." My appetite vanished as I balled my fists beneath the table. Mom tried to laugh it off, saying, "Oh, Dan, stop teasing." But she never really stopped him. She didn't dare. No one did. But this year, Dan wasn't satisfied with just words. After a few more beers, his mood turned dark. He started grilling me about why I wasn't helping out more around the house or pulling my weight. The irony was rich, considering Dan never lifted a finger unless it was to open another bottle. "You're such a lazy little prick," he snapped, leaning across the table. His voice was slurred, but his words cut deep. "Mom and Dad do everything for you. You think life's just going to hand you a free ride? I couldn't take it anymore, Dot." "At least I'm not a drunk," I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. The table fell silent for a second. I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through to him, but then Dan's face twisted into something I barely recognized. He stood up so fast his chair toppled over. His fists clenched like he was ready to fight. "You little shit, Dot!" he spat. "Say that again." Before I could even think about backing down, he lunged. His fist connected with my face and the world spun. I hit the floor hard, tasting blood and feeling the hot sting of tears. "Dan, stop it!" Mom screamed, rushing to pull him back. Dad grabbed Dan by the shoulders, dragging him into the living room while he cursed and yelled about how I deserved it. I sat there on the floor, stunned. My nose was bleeding, my cheekbone throbbed, and my mom. She didn't even look at me. She was too busy trying to calm Dan down, stroking his arm and whispering, "It's okay, sweetie. Just breathe." When the chaos settled, Mom pulled me aside. "You shouldn't have said that to him," she said, her voice sharp. "You know how Dan gets. You provoked him." "Provoked him?" I repeated, shocked. "He hit me in the face." "You're all right," she remarked dismissively. "Family sticks together no matter what. You need to apologize to Dan." It seemed like the floor had slid out from under me. Apologize? For what? For standing up to him? For bleeding all over her lovely table linen? I wanted to scream, but instead I just nodded numbly and walked to my room, shutting the door behind me. That night, as I lay in bed with an ice pack plastered to my swelling cheek, I realized something. Dan wasn't the problem. Not really. The true problem was my parents, how they supported, pardoned, and facilitated him. They would rather keep their golden kid safe than acknowledge that he wasn't flawless. And it's okay if that means putting myself in the wrong. Our family had been experiencing fissures for years, but they were now deeply and widely separating. I was aware that this was only the start. Following Christmas 2015, not everything simply returned to normal. In fact, they grew worse. It wasn't a one-time incident when Dan punched me in the face. It was a pivotal moment. He seemed to have full authority to treat me any way he pleased after that, as well as my parents. They did not allow that to occur. They made it possible. Naturally, Dan didn't apologize. He pretended that I was the one who had harmed him instead. He exuded this arrogant assurance as he strolled about the home, as if he had demonstrated something. I was unable to determine which was worst, his conceit or the quiet of my parents. Dad would murmur while Mom continued to say things like, "Dan is just under a lot of stress. Boys will be boys," every time I attempted to mention it. However, I wasn't going to ignore it. Not now. That night, something broke inside of me, and I realized I couldn't continue to act as though nothing was wrong. In order to avoid having to endure Dan's taunting, I began to completely ignore him, shutting myself in my room when he was home, and eating supper hurriedly. He quickly became aware of it, though. "Little bro, what's wrong? Are you afraid of me now?" he would say, obstructing my route down the corridor. He would lean in close and smile as if it were all a huge joke. "Do not be concerned. Until you offer me an explanation, I won't beat you again." It enraged me. I wanted to retaliate, to take that arrogant expression off his face. However, I was aware. Compared to me, Dan was larger, stronger, and far more careless. Any violent altercation would not go well. I thus took the only action I could. I began making plans to get out. I went all in on school. I understood that having excellent marks was my ticket out of this place, even if I wasn't a particularly good student. Claiming to have group projects, I began spending late hours at the library when, in reality, I just wanted to be somewhere other than home. Dan wasn't satisfied with my having my say, even if it worked for a time. He began acting more aggressively and coming up with new ways to irritate me. He would scrawl crude doodles over my notes if I left my textbooks out. If I attempted to view TV, he would switch the channel and instruct me to go do something constructive. And every time I challenged him, he would chuckle and tell me it was a joke. He went too far one night. I had just arrived home from school on a Friday. I had left my laptop charging on the dining table as I worked on an essay that would account for 30% of my final score. Dan was sitting there looking over my essay as if it were a comic book when I arrived home. "Nerd, what are you working on?" As he turned the pages, he smiled and murmured that. "Return it," I spoke, attempting to maintain a steady tone. "Relax, I'm only observing." Before I could stop him, I felt sick to my stomach because of a sparkle in his eye. He erased the file. As simple as that. In a flash, 3 weeks of labor were gone. I grabbed for the laptop, keeping it out of reach like we were playing keep away as he chuckled. "What on earth is the matter with you?" My voice cracked as I shouted, "Calm down!" Throwing the laptop on the table, he said, "You may rewrite it in your spare time. In addition, it could turn out well this time." I wanted to strike him, yell, or do anything else to make him stop wearing that arrogant expression. I knew it wouldn't matter, though. Dan was usually getting away with things, and this time was no exception. Shaking with anger, I rushed upstairs and slammed my room's door. My parents were asking Dan what had occurred downstairs, and I could hear them. His answer? "He's being theatrical, I see," and they took him at his word. They did, of course. My mother sighed and told me to stop allowing him to affect me when I tried to explain what he had done. "He is your sibling. A little teasing should be manageable for you." Joking? That's the name she gave it. That evening, I decided something. I wasn't going to stay in this house until I was a college student. I had to get out, and I had to get out quickly. I began searching for part-time work while saving as much money as I could. Where I went didn't matter to me. All I had to do was get as far away from Dan as I could. However, leaving would not suffice. I desired retribution that would truly harm him, not the trivial, impetuous kind. Something that would give him the same sense of fulfillment that he had given me over the years, totally alone, humiliated, and helpless. Although I didn't yet have a plan, I was certain of one thing. Dan's reign of terror would not continue indefinitely, and I was going to make sure I wasn't there to pick up the pieces when everything fell apart. The tension in the house reached an intolerable level by the spring of 2016. I was done being the peacekeeper because Dan had gone too far. I couldn't engage in physical combat with him. Even though I would always lose, I could begin to undermine the high regard my parents had given him. It was time to hold him accountable. Dan didn't realize he was in serious trouble. He was too preoccupied with riding his charm and my parents' unwavering support through life. However, his golden boy persona had flaws, and I intend to take advantage of them all. Although Dan was always careless, lately he seemed to be defying the universe to catch up with him. After one semester, he would leave community college, saying it was dull, and spend his days drinking, playing video games, and snoozing on my parents. They would gripe about his lack of focus. However, they would let it go as soon as he smiled his appealing grin. In the meantime, I was working hard. I had secured a part-time position at a nearby coffee shop. I saved as much money as I could for my upcoming getaway. I began to put more effort into my studies, not just to maintain my grades, but also to show myself and everyone else that I was superior to this chaotic home. Dan, however, was unable to let well enough alone. He detested it when he saw how hard I was working. It probably made him realize what he wasn't doing. He therefore intensified his efforts to be the largest jerk in the world. He began taking advantage of me by searching my room while I wasn't there and stealing the money I had saved. He would shrug and say, "I'll pay you back," when I questioned him. However, he never did. My favorite jacket, which my grandmother had given me before she died, was gone one day when I got home. Dan grinned and replied, "Oh, that old thing," when I questioned him about it. Sold it. Beer money was needed. That was it. The last straw. I was no longer merely furious. I was enraged. I also knew just how to strike him in the right spot. For all his bravado and charisma, Dan had a secret. He loved to act bulletproof, but he wasn't. For months, he had been robbing my parents. I had accidentally discovered the proof while purchasing alcohol and video games with my father's credit card. My parents left a bank statement with charges they couldn't explain on the kitchen counter. At first, I remained silent. I wanted to as astute as possible, to ensure that he couldn't use deception to get out of this situation. So I began to collect evidence. I would videotape him boasting to his buddies about living rent-free and squandering the elderly man's money. And I would also grab screenshots of his internet orders and receipts. Then I hit one night. Everyone else was asleep because it was late. I placed a well-organized folder on my parents' bedside table after sneaking into their room. All of the receipts, screenshots, and recordings I had gathered over the previous few weeks were included there. No note was left by me. I didn't have to. The evidence was self-evident. There was commotion when I got up the following morning. What on earth is this? The sound of Dad's words echoed throughout the home. He had the packet in his hand as I glanced out of my room. His cheeks was flushed with anger. Dan stood there looking like a deer in headlights while Mom sat on the couch sobbing. Dan said, "I can explain," but his father interrupted. "Describe. Dan, you have been taking from us thousands of money. You also believed we wouldn't notice? I intended to repay it." Dan's voice cracked as he yelled. "You see, I simply needed it. There is a lot of strain on me." "Stress?" Mom remarked in a shaky voice. "Dan, you're unemployed. You left school. How much pressure?" When they examined Dan's justifications, they were exposed. My folks weren't buying his nonsense for the first time. I remained in my room and watched the yelling fight. A tiny smile is beginning to appear on my face. Dan didn't get as harsh of a penalty as I had wanted. My parents cut him off financially, but they couldn't bring themselves to throw him out. No longer getting away with it. No more freebies with credit cards. Naturally, he was incensed. But he was powerless to stop it. At last, he had been revealed as a phony. Dan wasn't only upset with my parents, though. He was furious with me. In some way, he was aware that I had spied on him. He had no evidence, but he didn't require it. He made it his goal to ruin my life after that day. Late at night, while I was attempting to study, he would play loud music. He would inadvertently destroy my belongings, including my alarm clock, phone charger, and headphones. At school, he would spread gossip about me, accusing me of being a mommy's boy and a snitch. Yes, it was painful, but it was inconsequential. I had already won since I was preparing to depart before the end of the school year, while Dan was in a downward spiral. I saved up enough cash to move away. With a few roommates, I was able to find a modest apartment that was both close to the school and sufficiently distant from Dan and my parents. Mom sobbed and said, "You don't have to go." When I informed them I was going, "We can resolve this." However, I had already decided. I require room. I informed her that none of us would benefit from this. When I left, Dan remained silent. He only scowled at me from the room's corner. I believed his teeth could break because of how tightly his jaw was clenched. I didn't care that I could see the hate in his eyes. Let him despise me. I had freedom. Unsettling. If I had spent almost a year away from home. When Dan's life started to fall apart, I initially only received tidbits of information from my mom's sporadic messages or from common pals. However, it became increasingly evident as I gained more knowledge. At last, reality was catching up with Dan, and his golden boy appeal was running thin. I assumed that as soon as I moved out, I would feel instantly relieved, like if a heavy burden had been removed. And I did, in a sense. No more insults, no more pilfered cash. I no longer felt invisible in my own house. I still had a part of me waiting, though, waiting to see if Dan would be held accountable for his deeds at last. Initially, it appeared that not much had changed. Dan continued to live at home, taking advantage of my parents, and working part-time at a nearby hardware shop. Mom would occasionally contact me to let me know how hard Dan was trying, and how he was still learning. I paid her no attention. Her reasons no longer piqued my curiosity. Then my father called me one day. He lost his job. With a heavy voice, Dad remarked, "They apparently had enough after he arrived late too many times." I said very little, just being courteous. Oh, very unfortunate. However, I was smiling on the inside. It felt like poetic justice when Dan lost his job. Another fracture in his meticulously maintained facade. However, it didn't end there. The situation worsened throughout the course of the following several months. Dan began drinking even more, spending his meager funds on alcohol and outings with his similarly worthless pals. He would get home late, startling the entire house as he staggered through the door. Even though they were at their breaking point, Mom and Dad couldn't bring themselves to expel him. All he needs is some help. During one of her calls, Mom stated, "He's going through a difficult time. It sounds like a hard stretch that you caused yourself." Without trying to conceal my contempt, I answered. Dan's legal troubles were the true turning point. He had been drinking with a few of his pals when they thought it would be a good idea to drive to another pub. They got into a small vehicle accident as a result of one incident leading to another. Dan was detained for driving under the influence, but no one was gravely injured. I wasn't shocked to hear the news. To be honest, I was shocked that it hadn't occurred sooner. I was taken aback by my mother's phone call later that evening. With a trembling voice, she pleaded, "We need your help. Dan is incarcerated and we are unable to pay for his release." I nearly burst out laughing. "You want me to assist Dan? Really? He is your sibling." Her tone was heavy with remorse as she said, "Families remain united." My fury boiled when I heard the words "family sticks together." How many times did she tell me that? Just to turn around and justify Dan's actions? I was advised to suck it up how many times? To express regret? To maintain harmony while Dan escaped punishment for everything? "Sorry, Mom," I responded in a cold tone. However, I have lost interest in remaining together. I ended the call before she could continue her argument. I refused to be coerced by her into tidying up Dan's mess. Not now. I received an unexpected visitor a few days later. A knock on the door interrupted my rare day off as I sat in my apartment. He was there when I opened it. Dan appeared more unkempt than I had ever seen him. He had untidy hair. I nearly felt terrible for him because of the desperation in his eyes and the wrinkles in his clothing. Nearly. He shifted uneasily and replied, "Hey, may I enter?" I leaned against the door frame with my arms folded. "What are you looking for?" With a groan, he combed through his hair. "You see, I made a mistake. I need assistance." It was nearly satisfying to hear him own up to his mistakes. Nearly. However, it was insufficient to end years of suffering. "You will need to be more detailed," I said in a chilly tone. "What sort of assistance are you seeking?" He paused, looking at the ground. "Just enough money will let me get back on my feet. I promise to repay you." He recoiled at the biting, stinging sound of my laughter. "Do you need my assistance, following everything that you have done to me?" "A long time ago," he responded hastily. "I was a stupid child. I had no better knowledge. I lost my temper. You want me to save your bacon even though you knew precisely what you were doing. No way." Dan's expression contorted in exasperation. "Man, hurry up! Your brother is me. When you took my money, did you have that in mind? Or when my essay was erased? When did you strike me across the face?" I took a step forward, raising my voice. "Dan, you can't use the family card right now. That bridge was burnt long ago by you. He started to dispute, but before he could say anything, I slammed the door in his face. That was my final encounter with Dan. A few days later, Mom called and begged me to change my mind, but I refused. "You have the option to continue allowing him," I said, "but based on what I heard, don't expect me to tidy up his mess." Eventually, Dan was bailed out, most likely by my parents, who spent all of their money on his legal bills. However, his arrest had serious repercussions. It damaged his reputation. He couldn't keep a job to save his life, and his pals deserted him. In the meantime, I was doing well. I felt like I was finally in charge of my life after getting a promotion at work and meeting a wonderful person. Although I wasn't as consumed by Dan's suffering as I previously would have been, there was a certain joy in seeing that he was at last taking responsibility for his acts. I had a tremendous sense of freedom as soon as I shut the door in Dan's face. It went beyond simply refusing him the assistance he so much required. It was about taking back my authority. I had been the victim of his brutality for years, the scapegoat in the dysfunctional dynamics of my family. It was my turn to see him struggle now that the roles had been reversed. After I cut Dan out, my life was better than I could have ever dreamed. I was free of the burden of my family's turmoil for the first time. I immersed myself into my profession, and I began to see unexpected benefits from my commitment. After noticing my efforts, my boss gave me a promotion, which came with increased responsibility and a pay increase. I didn't merely accept the position. Outside of work, I was quite good at it. My private life was also flourishing. I had been dating an amazing person who not only accepted my history, but also pushed me to move on from it. After a few months, we moved in together, turning my little flat into a loving, funny home, something I had never experienced as a child. Although Dan's name was rarely spoken in conversation, I occasionally received updates from our common acquaintances or infrequently from my mother. She would call to let me know how difficult things were for Dan in the hopes that I would feel obligated to assist him. She would say he was your brother. Her voice was filled with that well-known blend of desperation and disappointment, and I would respond icily. He prepared his bed. Let him sleep in it. I had no intention of allowing her to pull me back into their insanity. I wasn't going to throw it all away because I'd fought too hard to avoid it. For someone who, during the period when my life was improving, had never once showed me any courtesy. The way Dan's was going was the opposite. His job loss had only been the first step. Even his so-called buddies had turned against him after his DUI. Due to his worsening drinking and lack of a reliable source of income, Dad began to borrow, or rather demand, money from my parents. They first caved. Mom couldn't stand to watch her golden son suffer, so Dad, as usual, gave in to her demands. However, they became impatient when they saw that Dan had no plans to change. He didn't want assistance. He was searching for support. I wasn't shocked to learn that he attempted to sell my parents' possessions to pay for his drinking. Dan had always been adept at taking without contributing. The only thing that had changed was that he no longer held me responsible for his issues. A few years later, the final act of karma occurred. I had developed a solid job by this time and was making enough money to support a comfortable lifestyle. I even discussed purchasing a home with my boyfriend. I had a nice, secure, happy life apart from the harmful influence of my family. I then received a call one day from an unidentified number. I said, "Hey!" Against my better judgment. On the other end, a voice croaked. My gut churned when I finally recognized it, although it took a moment. "Dan." My voice was flat as I spoke. "Yes," he mumbled. "I need your assistance." My curiosity overcame me, and I nearly hung up at that moment. "What sort of assistance?" He paused for a long moment before continuing. There was urgency in his voice. "Man, I'm screwed. My parents no longer allow me to live with them after I lost my place. All I need is somewhere to crash for a while, perhaps some cash to help me get back on my feet." I couldn't contain my laughter. A sound pierced the quiet, chilly and unpleasant. "After everything you've done, do you still believe I'll help?" "I know I made a mistake," he replied hastily. "However, we are brothers. You can't simply abandon me here. Observe me." With an unmistakable tone of delight, I answered, "Dan, you tore me down for years. Years. You want me to save you now? No way." "Come, man," he pleaded. "I don't have many demands. The answer is no. Therefore, you're not asking for anything," I yelled. "You don't have the right to treat me like trash and then turn around when your life collapses. You're alone." For the first time in years, I blocked the number and hung up before he could say anything further. I was genuinely liberated. Dan didn't call me again after that call. Based on my understanding, he continues to struggle, couch surfing, working odd jobs, and destroying every bridge he encounters. Finally, but not out of moral obligation. My parents have ceased supporting him. They just have nothing left to offer. For my part, I've created a life that I'm happy with. A successful, respectful, and loving existence. Dan attempted to take everything away from me. What's the best part? Knowing that he will never be involved, he must observe from the sidelines. Not all forms of retaliation include extravagant displays or spectacular altercations. Sometimes it's as easy as managing to survive despite everything. I regained the control Dan and my family had over me by making the decision to be happy. And that is the best kind of retaliation of all. I broke off contact with Dan and my parents years ago, and I haven't looked back. I have no regrets about my choice. I could not save myself any other way. However, I've also discovered that forgetting is not the same as moving on. Although the scars they left behind are still present, they now form a part of who I am, a reminder of my accomplishments. If I've learned anything, it's that blood doesn't define our family. It is characterized by mutual support, affection, and respect. And I discovered that in the family I've chosen for myself, not the one I was born into, allows live a fulfilling life, love completely, and not allow the past define who you are. The conclusion.